Good morning. Today we're going to be studying Matthew chapter 19. And what's interesting about this chapter is that Jesus very clearly demonstrates to us that we don't really understand what God's priorities are. That in most cases, the things that we think are important or valuable are not really that valuable at all to God. It starts out with the questioning about marriage and divorce, and how Jesus basically said that there's only one reason for divorce to be permitted. And the leaders, the religious elites of the time are asking him, why Moses permitted. And it wasn't because God was relenting or because the priorities that God had for people changed, but it was because of the stubbornness of people's hearts. That they were so certain that what they thought was important, that God essentially relented and said, look, I'm not going to make more of an issue over this. And Moses basically went out of his way to permit people to divorce. Now you'll also remember that Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land because he himself had been disobedient. So trying to cite Moses as one who would set the standard for the people was not really a very good idea. That was then continued with celibacy, where even despite what Jesus had said about marriage and divorce, that there are some who are not going to be given into marriage, and that people should not be fretting over trying to get married or trying not to stay married or changing the state that they are in life on their own priorities, on their own timeline. But that instead that people should be patient and should be doing what God is asking of them in that time of their life. And that if God does bring someone into their life, that if that opportunity does arise, then to embrace it, but not to make that a priority, not to look at what the world says is important, but to look at what God says is important. This is then further highlighted in the way that the disciples treated children that wanted to be near Jesus. And instead of going along with the disciples and rebuking the children and telling them to go away, as can so often be the case when children are interrupting, an adult conversation, instead he embraces them. He tells them that, the kingdom of heaven is of these, the innocence, the desire to be with Jesus above all else. Even if not understanding everything that's going on, the children knew that something was special about Jesus Christ and wanted to be near him. And we see this again with the parable or the story of the young ruler, who had lived a life that according to the world would have been perfect, but it still wasn't enough. It still wasn't everything that he needed to do. It wasn't about God's priorities. It was about satisfying the law. It was about behaving well, but not giving up the heart and not giving up the power and the wealth that he had accumulated to himself. And after all of these different stories where it's kind of discouraging about how what we think is important isn't, we do get some encouragement, because with God all things are possible. We don't have to figure this stuff out all on our own. We don't have to try and sort out what God's priorities are for us, searching blindly. God wants to be reaching out to us. God wants to help teach us, to instruct us. And we just have to start by asking. We have to recognize that what we are going to naturally think is a priority or is important is not, and ask God to help us to see clearly, to see differently, and to align our priorities to what he would have. So that's what we've got today in Matthew chapter 19. Think about that today. Think about how your priorities are not necessarily what God wants, and how we can ask, and God will help us to see clearly what our priorities really should be. Take care.